So my name is Richard, and I'm a marketing specialist for Allen and Heath USA. And today we're going to be talking about the main modes on dLive and Avantis. In other words, the ways that you can configure your main bus, your main left-right bus. Well, it's not always a left-right bus, as we're going to learn. But these are different ways that you can configure your main bus on dLive and Avantis, because there is some flexibility in that regard. It's not always just going to be a standard stereo left-right bus. You can have a lot more options when you make that jump to a sophisticated console like Avantis or dLive. So we're going to go through all the different options, and I'm going to explain what all of them are, and you'll be equipped to make the right selection and choose the right one for each context. So let's get right into it. If I could figure this out. Okay, there we go. So, so these are the different options that you'll have on a dLive or Avantis. So you can have no mains, you can have standard left-right, LR plus M sum, LR plus M, LCR, LCR plus, and on dLive only, you can have 5.1 surround. So if you have an Avantis console, I'm sorry to tell you, you can't mix in 5.1 very easily, but dLive does offer that feature. So we're going to go through each of these, and we're going to make sure that you understand what all of them are. And so that when it comes time for you to mix a performance and set up your show file, you'll know which one to choose. So let's start with how to change your main mode. So which menu do you access this in, and how you change it. So you'll recall that dLive and Avantis both have something called a flexible bus configuration. So it's not like, if you think back to like an analog console, it has a set number of auxes, a set number of matrices, a set number of groups, and you're kind of stuck with that. So if you're in a situation where, say, like you're mixing monitors, you need more auxes, but you don't need as many matrices or groups, you're kind of stuck with whatever the console is giving you. But when it comes to dLive and Avantis, you just have kind of a set number of total mix buses that you can allocate to each of those different types. So I can have a certain amount of groups, certain amount of FX, aux, matrices, and if I decrease the amount of one, I can increase the amount of another one. And so that applies to the mains as well, because the mains are, of course, a bus. So if you use a main mode that is more buses, then that's going to use up more of your total bus count. But if you use one that's less buses, then that increases your total bus count that you can allocate to other things. So this is the menu where you make that change. On dLive, it's under Mix Rack Config, Mixer Config, and you'll see there's that little drop-down menu where you can choose from the different options. And on Avantis, similarly, it's under Setup Config and Mixer Config, and you can make the change right there. So first option is no main. So why would you use no mains? It says right there on the slide, I gave it away. Usually it's used in monitor world. So if you're working at monitors, you're usually mixing for multiple auxes on stage for the different performers. You don't care about the main mix. That's usually handled by the front of house person. So in that case, you can swap it out for a no main. Well, not swap it out, but you can change to no main mode, and that will add additional auxes that you can then use on stage, or make more groups or more matrices or whatever it is you need. So it frees up 2 buses that you can use for other things. And you'll see at the bottom, that's legendary R&B singer Mavis Staples with a dLive S3000 being used at monitors for her and her band. So yeah, marketing. Next option is LR. So this is the obvious, straightforward one. If you go with like an entry level, very beginner level digital console, this is how the mains are going to be configured. You're probably all familiar with this. You have your mains is just a standard stereo bus. If you have a mono channel and you pan it dead center, it's going to be fed equally to the left and the right outputs. And then you could pan it a bit to the left and a bit to the right, and it will just reduce the amount that's going to the other side and increase the amount that's going to the side that you're panning towards. One thing to note is that on dLive and Avantis, you have the option of having your mains as a single fader that's stereo, or having 2 separate faders so you can control the balance between the left and the right. And that's under that same screen that we looked at earlier, where you can change the bus configuration. So very straightforward LR. Now we get to LR plus M sum. So the LR mix in this case, the LR aspect of it, is identical to what we just saw. It's still just a standard stereo bus, and panning works the same way. Everything works the same way, but it adds an additional mono bus that's a sum of the left and right. It just sums those two left and right channels together and creates a third bus that's a mono feed of those. So you can have 3 different output sockets, your left, your right, and then a sum of left and right that's a combination of the two. And you'll see that when you set up your faders, you'll have your left-right fader or 2 separate left and right faders, plus a separate mono fader that's a sum of the two, and they have independent level control. So some people might use this for a sub. There are people who are a bit more picky about it. They'll say, I don't want all my channels to be fed into my sub. Like you can theoretically send your whole main mix through a crossover and then feed that to a sub. But some people don't want that much kind of muddiness in their sub. They want to be a bit choosier about which channels go to the sub. So in that case, it might not be ideal. But there's a lot of different ways that you can use this. Like say you have like a mono stream or something that you want to have the identical mix to your main. That's one way to use it. It's really up to you. I'm not going to kind of tell you exactly how to use all these modes. I'm just going to tell you how they work so that you can really make the best decision for each scenario. So next we have LR plus M. So this is a bit similar to LR plus M sum, but here you do have the choice of which channels are fed to the mono bus and which channels are fed to the left and right bus. So you'll have the standard left and right works the same as always, and then a separate mono bus. And you have the option of assigning and unassigning different channels from each of them, from either the stereo mix or the mono mix. So this might be ideal for a sub, for example, if you have, you just want to assign, say, your kick drum and your bass and some kind of synth or something to your sub, you can assign those channels manually to the mono mix and then have the rest of it all go to, and the main channels all go to the left and right mix in stereo. So that's a good option for those kinds of scenarios. One thing that I'll note there is that the input channel level fader is the same for both the LR and M. So what does that mean? So if you have, say, a kick drum and you assign it to the LR mix, and then you press the mix button on the M channel, the fader of the kick drum is going to stay the same. The fader level for the channel that you're sending to the mains is always the same. It's just whether it's assigned or not. It's kind of a binary on-off thing for the M channel. If you want to have a different send level for the mono bus versus the main bus, then you'd probably be better off using a mono aux in that scenario, because you'll have a different option for send level versus the main. But in this case, a lot of people used to call me confused because they wanted to have a different send level. They thought it worked like an aux, but in this case, it's a bit different from that. The channel fader level is the same. LCR. So here it gets a bit more complicated. So you still have the LR and you have a mono bus, but the routing between them is not determined by assigning on off, and it's not determined by the fader level. It's determined through panning. So if you have something, a mono channel that's panned dead center, it's only going to go to that center mono bus. It's not going to be fed at all to the left and right sides. So that's really important to note. I used to get people who called me all the time that said, like, I'm feeding a channel to the center, but people on the sides aren't hearing it because they didn't really understand how LCR really works. So this might be useful in like a theater or something where you need that really kind of wide spectrum and you want to really keep things in place. But of course, it doesn't work for every scenario. You might have an LCR setup of your speakers, but you don't necessarily want to feed them in such a way that if you have a mono channel, it's only going out the center channel, it's not coming out the right, because you might have people sitting like right next to the right speaker and they're not hearing something that's crucial that's coming from the center channel. So the solution to that is LCR plus. So what LCR plus does, it's the same as LCR in terms of a mono channel in the center will stay in the center, but it adds an additional divergence control that allows you to kind of spread mono channels out to the left and right sides as well. So you'll see this yellow arrow on the diagram kind of represents a divergence control. If you just had a mono channel without divergence, it would only be going to the center. But if you increase the divergence level, you're now feeding it more and more towards the left and right to get that kind of spread of the channel. So it's still a mono channel. It's still being fed equally to the left and right sides, but it's being spread out now instead of just being focused on the center channel. And so that's really useful for those scenarios where somebody's like, the audience is kind of very spread out and the people on the right side might not hear crucial things from the center. You can now do that spreading out. And the way divergence works is that you would select the channel and go to the routing screen. You see that divergence control, and it's kind of like a little encoder that you can turn up. And you can also assign that divergence control to one of our custom encoders on dLive or Avantis if you want it to be more convenient. Does everyone understand LCR plus? Because that's one that gets a lot of confusion in my experience. That makes sense to everyone? Give me a little indication that you understand. Samantha, I know Samantha gets it. Samantha gets everything. Not fair. Okay, well, at least Samantha understands. If I could leave this class knowing that I did some good, I know Samantha understands. Why even bother with LCR? Well, that's a good question. So Dayton, if you're in say a theater and you want things to actually stay where they are, you might have, say, like sound effects that you want some of them to stay directly in the center. You don't want them going to the left and right side. Or you could have, say, like an option where it's kind of like a movie and you want the dialogue to stay in the center channel and not go out the left and right sides. That's usually how movies are mixed. So you can have like certain sound effects that are in stereo, but then dialogue is mono. It's really, there's no specific reason to use each of these. It's important to understand what they are so that when you get into those scenarios, you know which one to choose. Next is 5.1 surround, and that's only available on dLive, as I mentioned earlier. So you have the front, left, center, right are still the same, and you can have them work in either standard LCR mode, where center channel stay in the center, or you can have LCR plus mode for the LCR in the front, where you can do that divergence spreading if you choose. But it adds some additional buses. So you have surround left, surround right, and those are the rear left and right. And then there's the LFE, which stands for low frequency effect. And that's used to be the 5.1 in the 0.1 in 5.1 surround used to stand for 100 Hertz because there was a crossover for 100 Hertz that would feed the LFE. That's not really the case with dLive. You have more flexibility in that regard. You can manually send things to the LFE as you need. So it's not exactly 5.1, but it's in spirit, it's still 5.1 because it uses the same amount of channels and it's the same idea. So once you configure your mains in 5.1 mode, you'll see that there are additional channels that are available to you. So you have obviously the left and right and the center. Then you have the surround left and right, which again can be together as a single stereo fader or as two separate faders. And then you have the LFE, which is basically feeding the sub. And the routing between these is, once again, kind of like LCR, it's determined through panning. So if you select a channel with 5.1 enabled and you open the routing screen, you'll see this interesting little panning tool that you can use. And this red dot can be kind of moved around in the field to feed whichever one is closest to is going to be fed more. So you can kind of move things around in that two-dimensional field and feed it to different speakers as needed. So this is often used for like cinema and mixing movies and things like that. I know it's not very common, but it could be useful in a lot of situations. Yeah, I don't think this is the same as immersive audio. It's not just trying to cover more. It's not just trying to cover more areas of the venue. It's trying to genuinely kind of place sources where they're intended to come out from. To make it is a more immersive experience, I suppose, but it's not exactly the same as immersive audio. I wouldn't call it that necessarily. And see, oh yeah, I don't know exactly what you're asking, Dayton. Maybe are you talking about the arrangement of my faders here at the bottom? Because that was just me manually doing that. I didn't. We're going to get to that later, but you can assign these strips however you want to make it a bit easier for yourself. But yeah, so the LFE works kind of like the divergence control, where there's kind of a separate encoder that for each channel that's in your 5.1 mix that can be turned up to feed it more or less to the low frequency energy part of the mix. Yeah, exactly. That's right, Dayton. So yeah, to a few additional notes regarding all these main modes. This is what you were just talking about, Dayton. So after you change your main mode, so let's say you go from LR to LCR, your faders won't automatically adjust. You won't see that center channel automatically kind of pop up on your fader banks. It's just going to be another fader that's available in your strip assign screen. So you still have to manually go into the setup strip assign screen and drag down that center fader down, because that's a new channel that didn't exist before. And same with 5.1, you have all kinds of new faders that you have to bring down if you want to have control of them. So remember to do that after changing your main modes, because there might be one of those new channels that's not accessible to you right away. So make sure you do that. And divergence and front and rear pan controls in 5.1, those can be assigned to custom rotaries right above each of the channels for convenience. So if you wanted to kind of always have access to the divergence control of your channels, you can always have it there if you make it one of your custom rotary functions. No, Alex, actually, it doesn't use a low pass filter on the LFE bus. That's part of it. So each channel can be manually turned up and sent to the LFE bus, but the filtering of it, I think you would have to manually assign on the console or use a separate speaker processor. And so, yeah, we've gone through each of the main modes. Are there any questions from anyone? Or you could just look at my dogs.
Hey, this is William. Can I by the way ask you a question about SQ?
Sure, yeah.
Quick, simple question. I work with a friend of mine. He's a big time, well, he was a big time Midas. He's got like 5 different Midases.
Oh, my condolences.
M32, M32C, M32R. So he's got all a bunch of Midases. And he finally worked a couple gigs with me using my Allen and Heath SQ5, and now he loves it.
Oh, great.
So, and every time I go to help him with his stupid Midas, I go to touch his screen. He goes, "Why are you touching my screen?" Oh, geez, that's right. Your tiny little screen, I can't even touch it. Anyway, the simple question is this. If he gets something like an SQ5, can he attach a GX4816, which I think the answer is yes.
That's
but
right,
here's
yeah.
the big question, and this is the bonus question. Can he get 16 outputs, or is the SQ5 still limited to 12?
Well, it's you have, keep in mind, you have your mains, you have 12 stereo auxes, so that's really 24 outputs. And then you have 3 stereo matrices, so that's an additional 6 physical output sockets that you're using. Plus, you might assign the PAFL, you might assign the same aux to multiple outputs if people are sharing an aux mix. So the physical amount of output sockets is different from the amount of buses within the console. So even though you only see 12 mixes along the right side, each of those can be in stereo, and that takes up way more output sockets than you'd think. So yes, you can make use of all of those output sockets on the GX4816, even though you only have 12 mixes technically.
Okay, so if you had 12 mono mixes, you would only get 12. But if you assign them as if you assign 9 as a stereo, then you can use 2 outputs because it's in stereo. Is that right?
Yeah, if each one that's in stereo, like it's on SQ, it's kind of flexible in that regard, because each mix can be either mono or stereo. So depending on how many you have in mono and how many you have in stereo, the amount of actual output sockets that you're using from those same 12 mixes can really vary. And keep in mind, you still have the mains that are in stereo, and you still have matrices and other things.
Good.
So yeah.
Well, thank you very much for that.
Yeah, no problem at all. Any other questions from anyone?